All right, that is set. And we are ready to start. So first of all, Purim Sameach to everyone. This is still the day of Purim. We are still celebrating, at least until nightfall begins. And what better way to celebrate Purim than by continuing our discussion of the next holiday? As I've talked about before, Purim is the final holiday of the Jewish calendar, and Pesach is the first. So they are both naturally opposites, the first and the final, but they are also naturally brothers. They are very close to one another. And as we continue our discussion of Pesach, we are going to be, well, examining some of the greater difficulties in celebrating Pesach. But of course, with these greater difficulties come some amazing opportunities for experiencing things very, very deeply. Purim we only get for one day, whereas Pesach we get for an entire week, plus one if you live outside of Israel. And that means there is a lot more opportunity for depth and experience. So we talked last week about the Seder itself, the ceremony that takes place around our dinner tables with our family, maybe with our friends, give or take your own health needs. And now we are going to talk about some of the nuts and bolts of observing Pesach, because there is more to it than just the Seder. Yes, the Seder is absolutely the high point. It is the focal point. It is one of the most widely observed Jewish traditions throughout all Jewish communities. But Passover is a week long. So we're going to talk first and foremost about the other aspects of observing Passover. If you want to review the Pesach Seder, please go back to last week's video. So a quick reminder of why we are doing this, and this time with a slightly different emphasis. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, what is called matzah in Hebrew. And on the seventh day, there shall be a festival of the Lord. This is why there is a final day celebration of Passover as well as the beginning. Throughout the 7 days, unleavened bread shall be eaten. No leavened bread, what we're going to find out is called chametz, shall be found with you. And no leaven shall be found in all your territory. And you shall explain to your son on that day, it is because of what the Lord did for me when I went free from Egypt. And this shall serve you as a sign on your hand and as a reminder on your forehead, in order that the teaching of the Lord may be in your mouth, that with a mighty hand the Lord freed you from Egypt. You shall keep this institution at its set time from year to year. So we really focused on the second half last week. And today we're going to focus on the first half, the avoidance of chametz, unleavened or leavened bread, and the eating of matzah, leavened bread. So just as a quick recap, we have 4 main mitzvot that go along with Pesach. One of them is the Passover sacrifice, which we do not have because there is no altar in Jerusalem. The second is the Passover ritual meal, the Seder. We talked about that last week. Today, we talk more about eating matzah. We talked about maror last week as well. And most importantly for today, the removal of chametz, the leavening or leavened bread. And that is what's going to take up the bulk of our time tonight. But to understand how to remove chametz, we have to understand what it is. And to understand what it is, we have to understand what is bread. It's all very well and good to say we have to get rid of chametz, we have to eat matzah, but if we don't have the details of what those two things are, then it will be very hard to fulfill the command. Lucky for us, those two things are the same thing. That is to say, they are made with the same ingredients. And that may be a little shocking. People think of chametz as bread as being fundamentally different than matzah. And there is a big difference, which we'll get to, but the core ingredients are the same. In fact, the core ingredients have to be the same. You cannot fulfill the commandment of eating matzah by eating potatoes. You cannot fulfill the commandment of matzah by eating carrot bread. You have to fulfill the commandment of matzah with the same things that would be chametz, were you to still have them in your possession. Now, what are the things that make both chametz and a matzah? Well, those are the grains. Those are the 5 grains that are mentioned in the Torah. through different points and which are iconic with the land of Israel. As it says here in the Mishnah, these are the 5 things with which one fulfills the obligation on Pesach: wheat, barley, spelt, rye, and oats. I know many of you have probably never had spelt. It is not a very common food anymore. Rye you probably only have when you're having rye bread. Oats you probably only have if you're having oatmeal. And barley maybe in a soup. And wheat has become the king of all the grains. But if you lived in the ancient world, you would probably be eating from the different grains at different times as they ripened at different times and provided you with fresh food at different points in the year. But you can fulfill the mitzvah of matzah with any one of those 5, and you can violate the mitzvah of avoiding chametz with any one of the 5. These are the 5 grains. When I talk about grain or matzah or chametz, this is what I am talking about for today. So we are commanded to eat matzah, meaning a special type of bread made from one of these 5 ingredients during Pesach. But we are only commanded to eat matzah for the evening of the Seder, like we talked about last week, and if we want to eat bread. People can sometimes get a little confused, believing that they must eat matzah each and every day of the holiday. That is not necessary. You have to eat matzah for the Seder, both nights if you live outside of Israel. But if you don't want bread of any type, you can then avoid any bread for the next 5 days of the holiday, just eating fruit, vegetables, meat, egg, cheese, all those normal kinds of things, and not having any bread of any variety. That's okay. You're not obligated to eat matzah every day unless you want bread. And if you're eating bread, it's got to be matzah for the rest of the week, for the rest of that week. Now, we go back again to our teaching from this time, Mechilta the Rabbi Yishmael, and he tries to explain to us a little bit more about this matzah and chametz connection. 7 days, seor, which is the technical term for the ball of leavening that was used to jumpstart new dough, shall not be found in your houses. This tells me only that the transgression against finding it. Whence do I know the same for seeing it? Meaning, not only should I not find it, but not see it, and seor shall not be seen unto you in all of your boundaries. Also taken this time from our chapter 13 site we read earlier. This tells me only that seor is subject to the injunctions against being seen and found. Whence do we derive the same for chametz, meaning the actual bread that has been leavened with this leavening? It is written, chametz shall not be seen unto you, and seor shall not be seen unto you. Seor is likened to chametz, and chametz to seor, meaning they are comparable. Just as the first is subject to both, meaning finding or seeing, so the second. Chametz also cannot be found or seen. Just as the second chametz is of the 5 species, as we just talked about, so the first, seor, also is only made from those 5 species. So what is the difference then between matzah and chametz? They are both made by the same ingredients, both made with the same 5 grains, or one of them. What is the difference? The difference is time. That's all. That's all. Flour and water, they both make bread, they both make chametz. But with a little extra time is where you get chametz. That's where leavening happens. The dough begins to rise as the time begins to pass. And that is what creates chametz. Now, originally, back in the day, people could tell that their mixture of flour and water had begun to rise just by looking at the dough. However, as our sages point out, sometimes the dough didn't give any signs. It would look flat, but really chemically inside, the process of leavening had already begun, even if it wasn't visible to the naked eye. So our sages gave us a rule of thumb to help us avoid using dough that has leavened, because we don't want to violate this mitzvah. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish said, the time it takes a person to walk from Migdal Nunaya to Tiberias, which is a meal. That's 2,000 cubits, about 3,000 feet in the modern world. Now, There are many different definitions of how long this would be according to a modern clock. They didn't have modern clocks back then, but they had a general feeling of how long a day was. And the general estimate is 18 minutes. If you have mixed the water and the flour and it has sat for more than 18 minutes before it has gone in the oven, then it is chametz. It has leavened enough to be prohibited for the holiday of Pesach. If you have mixed the flour and water and it is less than 18 minutes before you put it in the oven, then you are making matzah. It is not about how poofy it is. It is not about how fluffy it is. It is not about how it feels or how it tastes. Matzah does not technically have to crack and crumble like a giant cracker in the modern baking system. Matzah can be technically soft. And indeed, when we talked about korach, the special sandwich that Hillel talked about as a reminder of the temple times, in the ancient world, it would have been a wrap. They would have bent the flexible matzah, which still would have been dense and stiff, but they would have bent that around the maror and the charoset, and of course the meat back when the sacrifice was still being offered. Nowadays, most people buy their matzah ready-made. I highly recommend it. Making matzah can be very tricky, and there are many other details that go into its creation to make sure that it is halachically legal for Passover. However, if you want to try making your own matzah not on Passover, just as an experiment to see what this flat, unleavened bread is like when you make it by yourself rather than buying it from the factory, by all means, try it out. I do have an older YouTube video about that process, which gives you the basic outline. But again, I wouldn't recommend trying this for Pesach because there are many things that can go wrong if you're not very careful and very knowledgeable about all of the details for making matzah. Some of you may know that in the Ashkenazic world, meaning the European world, there are additional stringencies regarding what is called kitniot. Kitniot is often translated as legumes into English as a type of reference to bean. It's not technically only legumes in the Ashkenazic tradition, so I'm going to use the term kitniot. Now, why would these beans, for the moment of our discussion, have become a problem in Europe? Why, in fact, would many European rabbis ban the use of beans during Passover? Beans are not one of the 5 grains. So what is the problem here? Well, we have to understand the cooking of the classical world. Bean flour, that is to say, beans ground up just like you would have ground up your wheat and turned into flour, was not unusual in many parts of Europe. You went for every possible bonus to your protein that you could find, and bean flour was one of them. I know that many of us now are not used to seeing bean flour or bean flour products, but this was not unusual. However, you must understand that before the modern world, with our bleaching of wheat and our special threshing and winnowing techniques, wheat flour, even wheat flour, used to be much darker. Certainly barley and the others also as well, but even wheat flour used to be a much darker color and not that brilliant white that you're used to seeing when you buy a bag of flour at the supermarket. That means that even wheat flour would look much darker and more similar to bean flour. Now that's a problem because there are potentials for mistakes. The first mistake, of course, would be that you would grab the wheat flour, thinking it was bean flour, mix it with water, and sit back and let it rise in order to make your bread for the day. Remember, people made their bread every day. During Passover, people made their own matzah every day. And if you grab from the wrong bag, well, then you would be in trouble. If you thought you were grabbing bean flour, but it turned out to be wheat flour, you have now violated the mitzvah and you have eaten chametz. Obviously, this would be a problem. Additionally, if you have bean flour as well as wheat flour, there was always a chance that there would be cross-contamination. Some part of the wheat flour might end up in the bean flour, and thus when you use the bean flour and were not so careful about the time because you didn't need to be, you would inadvertently be creating chametz as well. Because of this problem, the Ashkenazic authorities decided that the safest thing to do was rule beans off limits during the time of Pesach. Now, it doesn't mean that this put it at the same category and the same level as the prohibition on eating chametz, but this precaution became very common throughout the European world. And to this day, many Jews who come from a European background will not eat kitniot of any type during this time. Now, the conservative movement has said that if a person does not have this tradition, they need not take it on. They are welcome to go ahead and eat beans. Obviously, they still need to be careful about other Passover possible problems, but that the observation of kitniot can be continued if it is part of your own spiritual ancestry, but it does not need to be unnecessarily duplicated. And in fact, in the Sephardic world, the Jews who come from Spain and dispersed across the world, or the Mizrahi community, the Middle Eastern Jews, do not follow this practice. And they eat beans perfectly fine during the holiday of Passover. So now that we know what chametz is, the mixture of one of the 5 types of flour plus water, allowed to rise for at least 18 minutes of time, now we have to get rid of it. Why? Well, because God told us to not have any chametz in our possession. Not only should we not eat it, we also have to remove it. And this is unusual. For example, when we talk about not eating pork or shellfish or other non-kosher foods, we are not commanded that they not be in our presence. We are only commanded that we not eat them. For chametz, during that week of Passover, we are commanded to remove them, to make sure they are not anywhere, not only to prevent cross-contamination, but also to make sure they are gone. As the Mishnah tells us in Pesachim, on the evening of the 14th of Nisan, that's the day before Passover, they search the house for chametz by the light of a lamp. However, every place into which chametz is not brought does not require searching. Very important caveat, as we're going to see as we go through our cleaning instructions, that the cleaning is required not to clean the house. This is not spring cleaning of any kind. The cleaning is required to get rid of chametz. If there are parts of your house where you never take food, never take chametz, they do not need a search. For example, I have an attic here in my house, and I don't think I've been up there in about 4 years because there's not much that gets stored up there at all. It's important for checking insulation or checking the cables in the house, but I certainly never go up there with a sandwich. I have never brought anything even remotely food-like up those stairs. I do not need to search that area for chametz during the preparation for the holiday of Pesach. I simply don't go there. And so too for your own house, you may know that there are many parts of your house where you never take food. Now, if there are places where there is food, like your kitchen, dining room, or those types of areas, then obviously we need to check it. However, what counts as being a problematic amount? Do we need to get out a microscope and check every single corner of the linoleum or countertops to make sure there isn't even a molecule of chametz? Well, no. As it says in Pesachim, again, this time from chapter 3, regarding the dough in the cracks of a trough. We're talking about literally the kneading trough where people would mix the flour and water. If there be as much as an olive's bulk, meaning the size of an olive, in one place it is obligatory to remove it. But if not, it becomes annulled because of its small bulk. Right? So the idea here is that even something as obvious as a small piece of dough in the kneading trough, as long as it is very small, then we do not have to worry about that particular problem. That particular dough is nullified. Now, I will say in the modern world, most of us are stricter than that. If you can see a piece of dough, even if it is less than a size of an olive, most people will try to remove it. But it is a balance. The extra work can be a problem. And as I read from one of my favorite guides on cleaning for Passover, one might be tempted to insist on doing the extra work anyway. to be machnir, to be stringent. Indeed, many people are very tempted to try and make their Passover cleaning into a massive household effort that is exhausting. However, in these stringencies lies the grave danger of causing many laxities and brushing aside many mitzvahs completely during the Seder. Many like to do more cleaning than the bare minimum, to such an extent that some even incorporate their general spring cleaning into the required pre-Pesach chores. These extra exertions should not prevent them from fulfilling their obligations on Pesach, and particularly on the Seder night. It is easy to get carried away with cleaning. With Passover, we know this is a big mitzvah that must be done, and it does take extra time. However, we need to make sure we don't add extra time to that process, because by exhausting ourselves in unnecessary cleaning, and that's an important word, unnecessary, by exhausting ourselves in unnecessary cleaning, we could be preventing ourselves from enjoying the holiday as we are commanded to do so. The holiday should bring us gladness and joy, not pain and suffering. Additionally, for many people, the thought of doing the extra work makes them despair that they would do it correctly, and so they do no work and avoid all cleaning, even that which is required as a bare minimum. And thus the fear of doing extra work will often keep people from doing any work. That too is a major problem. So I'm not going to tell you not to take on stringencies that have been an important part of you and your family's traditions for years. What I am going to go through for the rest of this evening, well, large portion of the rest of this evening, is talk about the minimum that's needed so that you can prepare for Passover in a way that is not backbreaking and exhausting, but will leave you prepared for the holiday and hopefully also able to enjoy it in good spirits and with a good appetite, rather than in exhaustion or feelings of guilt and dread. So let's talk about some of the general rules for preparing for this cleaning. And I should point out that in many of these cases, a part of these topics would also be very applicable to our discussion on kashrut that we had a few weeks ago. 1, all property and possessions must be cleaned and checked to make sure that they are free of all chametz, except in the following cases. Now that all may be scary, but these exceptions are going to be large. 2, if during the year chametz is not brought into a place, like my attic, that place does not have to be cleaned out or checked for chametz. Similarly, if you have linen cupboards in which you only keep your sheets and towels, and you have never stored food there, you do not need to pull all of them out and go through them all through the washing machine. It is fine where they are. 3, any article, any item which is not used on Pesach does not need to be checked for chametz, provided it is put away properly and the chametz is sold. We'll talk about mechirat chametz a little bit more later, but I just want to give you the shorthand now that it is absolutely impossible to remove all chametz from a house. Even if you have gotten rid of every loaf of bread, every box of cereal, or every hot dog bun, the chametz that has become embedded in certain types of materials, like most porcelain plates or appliances, like a toaster, simply cannot be removed to comply with Jewish law. That doesn't mean you have to throw out all your plates and your toaster every year. It means that instead you sell that chametz. And the conservative movement through the Rabbinical Assembly is happy to help you with that. And for those members of congregation, for my congregation, Temple Israel, I can help you with that as well. But if you know you are going to sell your blender or those additional plates, then you simply need to put them away and sell them. You do not need to check them as well. 4, crumbs which have been rendered completely inedible to the extent that they are not fit to be eaten by a dog, which is a technical term in Jewish law, are not considered chametz. So that means that the scum that is on the bottom side of your refrigerator is not something you have to worry about getting to. You need not tilt your refrigerator back, crawl underneath it with a jack, and go to it with a putty knife. It is perfectly fine knowing that the various chemical cleaners, as we'll talk about, that you have sprayed into that area have made it so that it is no longer considered food. 5, the general obligation to check for and destroy crumbs does not apply if the crumbs are less than the size of an olive and are dirty or spoiled enough to prevent a person from eating them. And just to follow up on that, the household cleaner must spoil the crumbs slightly to the extent that people would not eat them. So again, if you have these little bits of dust and muck and all the various nooks and crannies, by all means, we should give it a good clean, meaning wash over it with a nice proper cleaner that makes sure that the food is no longer food, but is now completely blech because of having been sprayed with the bleach or other types of chemicals. And then it is now just dirt. Very important, dirt is not chametz. Mud is not chametz. Schmutz, one of my favorite Yiddish words, is not chametz. Chametz is only that which has come into contact with water if it comes from one of the 5 grains and been allowed to leaven and is still in an edible state because it has not been exposed to a contaminant such as the cleaner. That is all that we have to worry about. All right, take a quick pause and make sure there's no immediate hands up or questions before we get down into some of the specific questions on the next page. Floors. In our times, we do not have earthen floors, right? We do not live in houses usually with dirt for our floor. If you do, that's fine. I can tell you about how to handle that, but for most of us, that's not relevant because earthen floors often had deep cracks. And that meant that in those deep cracks, you would have to search to make sure there were no large crumbs of chametz that had disappeared down them. Instead, in our world, it is sufficient for floors to be swept and washed with a floor cleaner. Again, one of those chemicals. The small cracks do not have to be checked if the cleaning solution reaches into them. You are perfectly fine just giving a good Swiffer over your kitchen floor as long as you're using a nice cleaner along with the process. Food cabinets, your pantry. If the cabinet is going to be used on Pesach, meaning you will be storing food there and will be opening and using it, take out all of the food and wash it with a rag soaked in the cleaner. Be sure that the cleansing agent reaches into all the cracks and soaks into any crumbs that might be left there. On the other hand, if you're not going to be using the cabinet, then you simply have to close it up. Most people will put tape and or a sign on it to remind them not to open it and sell the chametz that might still be embedded in any of those racks or containers inside that pantry. Refrigerator. Take the food out, wash it with a rag soaked in a cleaner. That's it. And to be honest, your refrigerator should not take too long to clean as long as you've been cleaning it at least once a year. Most modern refrigerators are made of a very easy to clean substance. And with this, you know that it's also kosher for Passover. Sinks. Clean the sinks, obviously, and pour a kettle of boiling water into them and on their side. So you splash it around the edge in order to make sure that anything that might have been absorbed in the side would be released by the boiling water being poured across it. That being said, while that would be sufficient, it is the common practice in our current communities to also use a plastic tub as an additional barrier, an additional insert in the sink for the washing up. Counters. Counters, if they were used for hot chametz, meaning if you actually put hot materials on them, should be first cleaned well, as always with any kosher activity. Then either boiling hot water should be poured on them, or they should be completely covered so that nothing touches them. As with all of the kashrut instructions, please be very careful when you are taking boiling water and using it in this way. It is not something that should be thrown around because boiling water will hurt you. So you must be very, very careful. If you're not 100% sure, just go ahead and use a covering instead. Tabletops. Wash them with a household cleaner. Again, rendering anything that may be on them as now inedible. Your stovetop. Wash the top and side surface areas with a rag soaked in the cleaner. Old grates, meaning the burners, should be koshered by first cleaning them and then lighting all the burners, raising them to their maximum heat, and let it burn for 5 to 10 minutes. Now, if you use an electric stove, which is very common here in Florida, we don't have gas, we have electric, then it's even easier to simply wipe everything down, clean it, and know that you are compliant. The oven itself. Wash out any edible chametz with a rag soaked in a cleaner, meaning cover all the surfaces with your wiping and washing with that cleaner. Then heat the inside of the oven by turning the oven on the highest temperature for about 1 hour. Many ovens, in fact, all of the ones I've seen recently, also have what is called a self-cleaning cycle. And that is also wonderful, in fact, better, because it will, thanks to its built-in safety measures, be able to lock itself and turn it up to an even higher heat than any normal temperature you can get in your oven. So the self-cleaning cycle is best if that is an option for your appliance. Pots, pans, dishes, cutlery, all of those other little items that get moved around. Whatever is not going to be used for Pesach, you can predict it now, should either be locked up or sealed in a manner which will remind you not to use them on Pesach. Koshering of utensils for Pesach follow the general koshering rules covered in our previous class. So we talked about what to do with metal or wood or different types of materials in our class on keeping kosher. If you are unclear on any of that, please contact me and I'll be happy to fill you in. Dish towels. Regular dish towels may be used if they are washed with detergent and no food remains attached to them, which is a general rule, I think. Make sure your dishcloths are not so dirty that there is food still attached to them, and throw them in the laundry, give them a good wash, and you are fine. And tablecloths. Again, wash in the washing machine, and you can iron them with a usual iron in your normal way. You don't have to worry about any contamination from that process. Before we get to the selling, are there any questions about those points for cleaning? Okay, give me just a second. So I mentioned earlier, mechirat chametz, the selling of chametz. And this is something that confuses many people. It looked like the Torah was telling us that all of our chametz had to be thrown out. It had to be gone. And indeed, that is the initial impression. And in the ancient world, it was even possible to achieve. After all, in the ancient world, people had a couple pots, they had a couple knives, and most of your plates were wooden slabs or bits of pottery that you might remake a new clay pottery every year. No problem. You could either make everything re-kosher, or if you had to, you could throw it out and get something and make something new for the holiday. Nowadays, for about the last 200 years especially, it's not that simple. Most everyone owns pots, plates, or other items that are either too numerous to be koshered or simply cannot be physically koshered. If you were to try and kosher every plate that you have in your house, especially if you are correctly trying to keep a separate set of pots and pans and plates for all of your meat and your dairy food, then that would be a huge undertaking. Additionally, many of those types of pots and pans, or more importantly, the plates being made from pottery, cannot be koshered. They could not be made kosher for Passover. And so you would need to dispose of them every single year. And like I mentioned before, things like blenders and toasters are often unable to be koshered, even with the best of intention or efforts. So what do? Do we just throw everything away? Do we just chuck everything in the garbage or give it all to a non-Jewish friend? Well, first of all, throwing it away would be a problem because there is another mitzvah called bal tashchit, of not wasting. And if we were to just throw things away every year when there was no reason, then that would be a problem. And there is no reason to do so because there is an alternative. And the alternative is mechirat chametz, the selling of chametz. So during Passover, we put things away, we label it, we seal it, we make sure that it is clearly marked so that we know what it is and that we will not use it. And then we sell the chametz in the item, not the items itself, but the chametz that is in it, to a non-Jewish person. This is usually handled by your synagogue rabbi, that's me, or the conservative movement has also made it available through their online portal to make sure that it can be done appropriately. And at the end of the holiday, there is a return, a buyback, if you will, of that chametz, and so it goes back to you, the original owner. Now, like I said, this is best handled by a competent authority, but I want to make sure we understand the basic idea. You are not allowed to own chametz, but someone else's chametz, if it is their property, can be within your domain. If someone else parks their car in my garage, that doesn't make it my car. And if I'm not allowed to have a car, for example, and they park in my garage, I have not violated my prohibition on owning a car. It's their car. It just happens to be on my property at this time. So too for chametz. If we have sold the chametz, the embedded content within our pots, pans, knives, or other items, to somebody that isn't Jewish and thus not bound by the laws of Passover, the fact that it happens to be on my property because they haven't collected it, if you will, doesn't make it mine. It just means it's temporarily there. And this allows us to be able to observe the mitzvah itself as written, while still also avoiding any needless waste and destruction of property, and being able to thus completely observe the holiday. Now, when it gets down to the wire, as most people begin their preliminary cleaning, usually about a week or less prior to the holiday. And yes, some people start much earlier, but that usually is then getting into the spring cleaning territory and can make people a little crazy. By all means, if you like spring cleaning, that's great. Do it after the holiday, not before. So when we get down to the wire, we get down to that evening. Well, on the evening of the 14th of Nisan, as we said before, they search the house for chametz by the light of a lamp. Every place of which a chametz is not brought does not require searching. Now, in order to perform this search, we will say a blessing because we are commanded to remove our chametz. And so, with the blessing we say before we begin this search, this bedikat chametz, is Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam Asher Kedishanu B'mitzvotav. It should sound very familiar from our discussion of blessings in a previous class. V'tzivanu al biur chametz, and has commanded us regarding the destruction of chametz. Now, like I mentioned, we search all across the house with a candle or with a flashlight. That's also fine. And we do this because we are trying to make sure we didn't miss anything. Now, in the modern world, most of us are going to be very sure we have not missed anything because we have our house under good surveillance, if you will. And that means that many people, my own family included, will often hide, in quotes, a few pieces of chametz so that when the search is being undertaken, it will not be in vain. Judaism does not like us to use a blessing that is void, meaning for no good purpose. It's considered to be a desecration of God's name. And thus, we put a couple pieces around to make sure that indeed there are a few pieces of chametz to find and to remove. Again, in my own particular house, we have one person hide them, and then the rest of the family who say the blessing are the ones that are searching for them. So it does actually provide a searching atmosphere. Many also have the custom of using a feather and a wooden spoon during the search, but this is a relatively recent custom and should not be considered a requirement. Once we have found what we are going to find and set aside what we need to set aside for its removal, we then make a formal declaration that anything that we might have missed doesn't belong to us. Just as we talked before about the mechirat chametz, the sale of chametz, here we are engaged in what's called bitul chametz, the nullification of chametz. Now, the formula that you see here, all chametz or leaven in my possession that I have not seen and have not destroyed and do not know of shall be nullified and become ownerless like the dust of the earth, is traditionally recited in the Aramaic. Now, the Aramaic here may seem more unfamiliar to you than any Hebrew seems, but Aramaic used to be the more common language for most Jews for many parts of our history. And so the Aramaic phrase became traditional because it was understood. Nowadays, if you live in an English-speaking country and know English, then by all means, make sure you use the English because this is a legal declaration that you need to understand as you recite it. If you understand the Aramaic, by all means, continue to read the Aramaic and use that as well. The next morning, we engage in what's called biur chametz, the burning or destroying of the chametz. And the common tradition is to burn it. But if you have no fireplace or any other way to burn it, it is fine to also destroy it in other ways. Some people will flush it down the toilet in a way that doesn't mess up your plumbing, I hope, or will engage in other ways of disposing of it from their possession. And again, the formula that is repeated will say that anything I have missed, anything that I have not destroyed, don't assume that I didn't destroy it because I'm still claiming ownership of it. Anything and everything that is chametz is not mine. In fact, it is ownerless. If anybody were to walk in and find the loaf of bread that I completely missed under the sofa, it's theirs. It's not mine. It just happens to be there, but I totally forgot that it was there. And for whatever reason, didn't notice it on my search. And it literally is ownerless and thus not my responsibility at that point. Now, during the same time, when we are so focused and engaged in the cleaning process, we also need to make sure in the time leading up to Pesach that we join in the mitzvah of Maute Chitim. Maute Chitim is the mitzvah of giving to others through tzedakah, through charity, to make sure that they can also celebrate Pesach. Pesach can be a little bit expensive. Matzah is more expensive than most bread. People need wine for doing the 4 cups that we talked about. And most people like to have a nicer meal than average in order to really celebrate the holiday. For some families, that is difficult for them to reach with their financial situation. And so Maute Chitim, donations to the poor in the time leading up to Passover, is very, very important. So what then do we need to make sure we have as part of our checklist, our preparation for Passover? In addition to all the cleaning, in addition to the Seder itself, what are we trying to think about beforehand? Well, first and foremost, are you inviting people to your house for the Seder? Now, the last couple of years, this has been tricky. Because of COVID, many people have had reduced Seders, sometimes only their household, sometimes only their immediate family. Now, thank God, we are coming to the end, please, of COVID, and you need to be honest with yourself and your family regarding your health needs and the health needs of other people of what kind of Seder you would like to have this coming year. Perhaps you are fully vaccinated and strong and healthy and able to have a larger number of guests. On the other hand, perhaps you should be still a little cautious and wait until you have that larger mingling of different people. That is something to discuss with your family and your healthcare providers. But apart from the invitations we might make to people, what else can we do to get ready? Well, we should review the Haggadah. Yes, I went through the Haggadah very, very briefly last week, going over the major highlights, but the Haggadah plus the reams of commentary that have been written about it are available to study in the months leading up to Passover. Well, month now, because we've already hit Purim. Please study it before the actual Seder night and generate the ideas or generate some of the answers that other people may need for the questions they ask. Similarly, you should also be reviewing the story of the Exodus. Reading the initial set of the chapters from the book of Exodus will give you a much better grounding of understanding what exactly happened. And no, watching Prince of Egypt or the Ten Commandments doesn't count. That is not a proper review of the actual story of Exodus. Many people will also review Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs from the Tanakh, from the Bible. This book of the Bible is not only a beautiful story of love between a man and a woman, but it is also a beautiful allegory of the love between God and us. Also, you can examine your own life for spiritual chametz. Now, chametz is, as we've talked about, this leavening process, this poofiness, and many of the great teachers throughout the centuries have compared chametz to arrogance, to pride, to snobbery, and focus on materialism and many of our other spiritual problems that we have in our own life. And by reviewing that aspect, cleaning ourselves of those traits, we are preparing ourselves truly to be liberated. Which brings me to the last point on this page, which is that we must try to look at our life and ask, how are we still enslaved? Yes, we probably don't have chains on our hands. We are not pushing mud bricks into place in Egypt. And if you are, I am very sorry, and I hope that you'll be free soon. But many of us continue to slave away in ways that we feel bound to do, that we need to be liberated from. Whether it be something as mundane as a bad habit, or whether it be something as serious as being in an abusive relationship, we are often found to be slaves in ways that we are reluctant to admit. In the time leading up to Passover, examine them and look for the path to freedom. Realize that God wants you to be free from the trivial problems as well as the huge ones, and see what steps can be taken to enjoy that freedom. Now, like I mentioned, we are in this case of COVID, and that can create some certain issues. Thankfully, as we are coming out of it, I can tell you that the Passover supplies are already beginning to appear. It doesn't look like there are many shortages this year, maybe margarine this year. That's always been an up and down. But go ahead and get your shopping done as early as you can. Keep the things that needed for Passover separate from your regular food, and you'll be able to be ready. God willing, we're not going to be hitting into a full lockdown. God willing, we will not have any major shortages, and we'll be able to get by just fine. But it is an important thing to remember that the last 2 years have been difficult, to say the least. And hopefully this year, as well as the years that come after, are going to be easier for us to enjoy and celebrate this holiday in peace, in good health, and with a full measure of gladness. So that as we lift each of those cups, as we enjoy our meal and the company around our table, we are able to say, this is what freedom tastes like. And perhaps the experience of COVID will put a different spin on our feelings of liberation as we are coming out of the pandemic. Perhaps we will truly appreciate what freedom is like, as many of us, I believe, do take it for granted far too often. And recognizing what true freedom is, if it is pushed along a little bit through this, is good, but more importantly, is something that we should be working to defend for ourselves, for our country, as well as for the world at large. And with that, we will wrap up for tonight. Are there any final questions or comments that people would like to share before we finish for today? All right, then. Thank you all for joining me so much on both YouTube and Zoom. Take care, everyone. And again, we're not quite done with Purim. I look out to see the light. So Purim Sameach and an early Shabbat Shalom.